So hello again, everyone. Welcome to Chester Library. We have a very special presentation tonight with President Bob Kendrick of the Negro League Museum, and he is live from Kansas City. Hi, Bob. How are you?
Oh, I am fine, thanks. How are you?
Great. Wonderful to have you. So with that, I'll let you start your presentation. And thank you again, everyone. We are recording this session. Please keep yourselves on mute.
Well, hi, everybody. I'm Bob Kendrick, as you mentioned. I'm the president here for the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. And a little bit about me, I started here at the museum in 1993 as a volunteer. Who knew? Yeah, I began as a volunteer. I was working for the Kansas City Star at that time. I drew the assignment of promoting the museum's first ever traveling exhibition, an exhibition called Discover Greatness. It is still touring the country. As a matter of fact, it is in you all's neck of the woods because it's over in Montclair, New Jersey at the Yogi Berra Museum, where it was playing to rave reviews prior to the pandemic. And so the folks over at the Barra Museum, however, did create a digital experience around this the exhibit called Discover Greatness. Well, we created this exhibit in 1993, and it debuted in a storefront space just right across the street from where my office is. And that is how I got involved with the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. It became a labor of love. I fell in love with the story and I fell in love with the athletes who made the story. And I considered myself to be a baseball fan. And I quickly realized that there was this chapter of baseball and Americana that I really did not know much about. And guys, I literally became engrossed in it. I wanted to learn as much as I could, and I didn't want to keep it to myself. I wanted everybody else to feel the same way that I felt. And then I started to meet the players. And once I started meeting the players, I fell even deeper in love because they had such an amazing spirit. None of the players that I've ever encountered harbored any bitterness or any ill will toward anyone who may have attempted to perpetrate something against them as they were playing baseball in this country. Well, number one, I quickly found out that they never adhered to the belief that the major leaguers were better than they were. Everybody else believed that the major leagues were better than the Negro League, but they never succumbed to that. So they were very self-assured, and and so they were never bitter about baseball because they felt like they were playing the best baseball that could be played. And yet, while they certainly didn't enjoy the things that were happening to them as they traveled the highways and byways of our country, they wouldn't let that harden their hearts with hate. And I'll be honest, I find that to be an amazingly endearing quality. And so, yeah, I fell deeper in love with the story and these incredible athletes. I had no idea that it would lead me down this amazing career path that it has. But for me, it all started as a volunteer. A little bit about this museum. It was established in 1990 across the street in a tiny one room office, about a fraction of the size of the office that I'm in right now. And it had a few pictures hanging on the wall. I would never forget. I walked in for the first time when I'm coming down to meet the then executive director of the museum, a guy named Don Motley. And I was coming down to talk with him about the campaign that we were going to put together to promote the Discover Greatness exhibit. And so I come in and I walk into this little office and I say, well, I'm looking for the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. He looks up at me, he says, son, you're standing in the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. And that's how we got started. And guys like the late great Buck O'Neill and other local Negro leaguers literally took turns paying the monthly rent to keep that little office open. And of course, with it, our hopes and dreams of building a facility that would pay rightful tribute to one of the greatest chapters, not in baseball history, but in American history. And we've grown leaps and bounds since that time. We went from that one room office to now 10,000 square feet of exhibit space that chronicles the story of Black baseball in America in general and the professional Negro League specifically. And then a 40,000 square foot expansion project looming on the horizon as we restore the Purcell YMCA to turn it into the future Buck O'Neill Education and Research Center. But even more amazingly, we go from this one room office in 1990 to being recognized as America's National Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, as deemed and designated so by the United States Congress in 2006. There's this wonderful passage when you walk into the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, and this is taken from the Roman Catholic Bible, Ecclesiastes, that simply says, "My son, if you aspire to be a servant of the Lord, prepare yourself for testing, set a straight course and keep to it, and do not be dismayed in the face of adversity." You see, that was Negro Leagues baseball in a nutshell. These athletes loved the game of baseball so much that they were willing to endure whatever social adversity confronted them as they traveled the highways and byways of our country just to play baseball. Their passion for our sport would not only change the game, it would change our country for the better. And that's the story that we celebrate here at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. For those who are wondering why a Negro Leagues Museum is in Kansas City, well, it starts with this dude, the legendary Andrew Rube Foster, who was actually from Calvert, Texas. But it would be Rube Foster who would lead a contingent of 8 independent Black baseball team owners into a meeting that took place at the Purcell YMCA, just a stone's throw from my office, right around the corner. And we're right now in the process of saving that old historic landmark to convert it into an education and research center in memory of the late great Buck O'Neill. But that's where the meeting took place. So Rube led a contingent of 8 independent Black baseball team owners into Kansas City. They meet at the YMCA. Out of that meeting come the birth of the Negro National League, the first successful organized Black baseball league. Rube Foster, folks, was an absolute genius. Rube, who is recognized as the father of the Negro Leagues. Rube Foster was light years ahead of his time. Rube Foster had been a great player in the pre-era of the Negro Leagues, the early era of Black baseball. As a matter of fact, he is credited with having invented what we now know to be the screwball. Back then, it was called a fadeaway. And Rube perfected this pitch, so much so that the great major league manager, John McGraw, would sneak Rube Foster into his camp so that Rube Foster could teach Christy Matheson how to throw the screwball. Rube never got credit for it. He's best known, however, as this visionary, this tremendous leader. As I mentioned, he would organize and establish the Negro Leagues here. He would become the president of the Negro Leagues. He owned the Chicago American Giants and he managed the Chicago American Giants. And as a manager, Rube Foster was known to fine his ball players as much as $5 in the early 1900s if you were tagged out standing up. You were supposed to slide. Rube would draw a circle down the first base line and a circle down the third base line. And if every one of his players couldn't drop a bunt inside that circle, Rube would fine them. He was adamant about the style of play that became signature Negro Leagues baseball: fast, aggressive, daring. They bunt their way on, they steal second, they steal third, and if you weren't too smart, they were stealing home. And that is the style of play that Rube absolutely put his stamp on. This is J.O. Wilkinson, or Wilkie as we affectionately know him as. J.O. Wilkinson was the only white owner of the original 8 Negro League franchises. He owned the great Kansas City Monarchs. Now you have to remember, initially, Rube did not want any white ownership. He was absolutely against any white ownership, but he kept hearing these great things about this guy from Algona, Iowa, named James Leslie Wilkinson. J.L. Wilkinson was a 2000 man in the 1900s. J.L. Wilkinson was not afraid of color. You know, you see color, but it's how you react to color. And Wilkie respected those who didn't look like him. He was very comfortable in his own skin, which allowed him to be comfortable being around others who didn't look like him. And so Wilkie had owned a team called the All Nations. The All Nations were a homogenous group of athletes made up of Black, white, Asian, Native American, Hispanic ball players. And that team would eventually evolve into the Kansas City Monarchs, one of the greatest baseball franchises, not in Black baseball history, but in baseball history. It would be J.L. Wilkinson who would pioneer night baseball in the Negro Leagues 5 years before the major leagues ever played a night game. So Rube eventually relented, but he, I think the key thing that helped him decide to let Wilkie be involved was the fact that Wilkie also had access to stadiums. And Rube needed that. In order for his new league to survive, he needed that access to stadiums. Wilkie comes in, he brings in his charter Kansas City Monarchs. And as I mentioned, the Monarchs would go on to become one of the greatest baseball franchises in baseball history, one losing season in their almost 40-year existence in the Negro Leagues, sent more players to the major leagues than any other Negro League franchise. There are those who will say that the Kansas City Monarchs were the New York Yankees of the Negro Leagues. There are others who will say that the New York Yankees were the Kansas City Monarchs of Major League Baseball. And as I mentioned, we talk about the innovations, the game changing aspect of what the Negro Leagues represented. Advents such as batting helmets, the shin guards, plays like the hit and run, bunt and run. These things all come out of the Negro Leagues. They helped make the game the global game that it is today. They took baseball into Canada. They were oftentimes the first Americans to play in many Spanish speaking countries. Believe it or not, it was a touring team of Negro Leaguers that introduced professional baseball to the Japanese going all the way back to 1927. That is years before Babe Ruth and his All Stars would visit Japan. Now, they've been commonly credited with having taken professional baseball to the Japanese, but it's not true. It was actually a team called the Philadelphia Royal Giants who would go to Japan in 1927, play a 24-game exhibition series. They go 23-0-1 on the tour. The tour was so successful that several years later, Ruth and his All Stars would get invited over. And as I mentioned, it was J.O. Wilkinson who would pioneer night baseball, portable generated light towers. So not only could they play a night game here in Kansas City, they could load them up on the truck and play a night game virtually anywhere. Truth of the matter is, by the time they play that game, Major League Baseball says that Cincinnati Reds versus the Philadelphia Phillies in 1935 was the first professional night baseball game. Well, the Monarchs would debut night baseball 5 years before in 1930. Truth of the matter is, by the time they played that game in Cincinnati, the Monarchs on a team called the House of David had taken night baseball all the way out to Seattle. And we talked about the fact that this is a global game. And it is a global game in large part due to the Negro Leagues, but they never were credited with making it the global game. As I mentioned, they were taking baseball all over the globe, first Americans in many Spanish speaking countries. And the interesting thing about it, when Negro League players would go to those Spanish speaking countries, they were treated like heroes. They were staying in the finest hotels, eating in the finest restaurants, and then you come back home and be treated like a second class citizen. And I had the great pleasure of showing this magazine cover that you see on the screen to our friend, the great Japanese ball player Ichiro Suzuki. And he just lit up. He had no idea that these brothers had been to Japan as early as 1927. The magazine is written in old Japanese, but he was actually able to decipher what was on the cover of the magazine. And then we talk about the players who you should know, but maybe you don't know. We start with the legendary Josh Gibson, arguably the greatest combination of power and average this sport has ever seen. He was oftentimes referred to as the Black Babe Ruth, but there are others who saw Gibson play who will call Ruth the white Josh Gibson. I love this photograph. Trademark rolled up left sleeve, big, powerful forearms, big, powerful thighs, and great eyes. The late, great Buck O'Neill would describe Josh in this manner, that he had the eyes of Ted Williams and the power of Babe Ruth rolled into one dynamic package. His outs, as we say in the game, were loud outs. The third baseman and the shortstop were damn near in left field when Gibson came up. I guess you could say that was the Negro League's early version of a shift because they were almost in left field because you're not creeping in on Josh because you can get killed down there. Everywhere this man played, he hit. He wasn't just a great power hitter. Josh was a great hitter. Lifetime batting average of 354. And in head to head competition against major leaguers, hit over 420 in countless exhibition games. And what makes it even more remarkable, particularly if you're a fan of the game, he was doing this as a catcher. Catchers don't do that. Yeah, no, you get one or maybe the other, power or average, but rarely are you going to get that combination of the two because the position's just so physically demanding. Josh wasn't a good catcher. He was a great catcher. Rifle arm. He's throwing guys out from the crouch back in that era, and Buck O'Neill said he had complete control of his pitching staff. So he called a great game as well and was a good running catcher. He's going to steal you 20, 25 bases or more to go with that big bat that you see in that picture. And when I say big bat, I mean big bat. 40-ounce, 41 inches. And look where he's got it grabbed. He's not choking up. He's got it gripped below the knob. Just incredible power. And then there's the great Cuban ball player, Martin de Higo, nicknamed him El Maestro, the master, because he could do it all. Played all 9 positions, played all 9 of them well. He is the only baseball player in the history of our sport to be enshrined into 5 different countries' baseball halls of fame. He's in the Mexican, Cuban, Venezuelan, Dominican, and in Cooperstown. One year in the Mexican League, De Higo wins the pitching title, goes 19-2 with an 0.90 ERA. The sucker hits 387 that same season and won the batting title. That don't make any sense. And for me, the greatest nickname in baseball history, bar none, is the legendary James Thomas Cool Papa Bell. Cool Papa, folks, is still believed to be the fastest man to ever play this game. Clocked him in an amazing 12 seconds, circling the bases from home to home. His good friend Satchel Paige would say of Cool that he was so fast he could walk in a room, turn off the lights, get in bed, pull up the covers before the room went dark. That is actually a true story. But as I tell my guests all the time, you do not have to fictionalize the speed of Cool Papa Bell. Cool Papa Bell once stole 175 bases in a less than 200 game season. He twice, honest to God's truth, twice scored from first base on a bunt in exhibition games against Major League All-Stars. They were playing in Mexico, and Buck O'Neill says that Cool Papa goes from first to third so fast on a single that the Mexican team stopped the game in protest because they swore he had cut across the diamond, that there was no way any man could get around the bases that fast. How fast was Cool Papa Bell? The legendary Jesse Owens would never race Cool Papa Bell. Flat out refused to race Cool Papa. Jesse Owens would race horses around the bases, but never Cool Papa Bell. And of course, the immortal Leroy Satchel Paige, arguably the greatest pitcher this sport has ever seen. We know for certain the oldest rookie in the history of Major League Baseball. Now, Major League Baseball says that Satchel was 42 years old when he finally joined the Cleveland Indians in 1948 as a rookie. Some of you recall, and I know I was talking, I believe, with John. No, it wasn't John. It might have been, well, the other John, John Baxter, before we started the program, that they won the World Series. Cleveland won the World Series in 1948 with Larry Doby and Satchel Paige. And Satchel goes 6-1 with a 2.4 ERA his rookie season at age 42, which means he may have been closer to 52. Satchel never told his real age. And quite frankly, guys, I don't think Satchel knew his real age. But I can tell you this, there may have been some who did it just as good, but no one did it better than Leroy Satchel Paige. In his prime, they clocked his fastball at 105 miles per hour. But what really made Satchel so special, and I can tell you right now, 105 is pretty doggone special. But what really made Satchel so special was 105 with pinpoint control. He could put it exactly where he wanted to put it. And guys, I'm not talking about throwing strikes. Uh-uh. The catcher sat the target. He hit the target. He didn't miss. You see, he didn't warm up in the bullpen like most pitchers do, throwing to the catcher across home plate. You know what Satchel would use? Satchel would use a stick of foil chewing gum wrapper. This is honest God's truth. The catcher would sit that chewing gum wrapper on top of home plate. And wherever the catcher moved the chewing gum wrapper, Satchel right over the top of that chewing gum wrapper. And even as an old man, while he couldn't throw it as hard as he once did when he was in his prime, he could still put it exactly where he wanted to put it. And he was able to get major league athletes out at an ungodly age, whether it was 42 or 52. He was absolutely incredible. Jackie Roosevelt Robinson. And I love this picture because so many of our visitors had no idea that Jackie Robinson's illustrious professional career began in the Negro Leagues with the great Kansas City Monarchs. 1945, he would join the Monarchs, and by the end of that season, he was gone. But during that year that he was here, he fell in love, y'all, with everything that Kansas City is famous for, barbecue and jazz. He loved the ribs at a place called Old Kentuck Barbecue. Old Kentuck Barbecue would become the forerunners of the great Gates Barbecue chain of restaurants that are world renowned here in Kansas City. And of course, he fell in love with jazz. And while New Orleans may lay claim to jazz, it was Kansas City that gave jazz its soul. And as I mentioned, by the end of the year, Jackie was gone. His teammates had no idea where he was. He had literally disappeared. And as we know, Branch Rickey had summoned him to New York. And Rickey had done so under the auspices that he was creating his own version of a Negro League. Because number one, he did not want the other major league owners to know that he was contemplating this move to try and integrate the game. And so he kind of purported this idea that he was creating his own version of Negro Leagues, going to pay those players more money than they were making in the existing Negro Leagues. And so they've been scouting Jackie, they bring him over to meet Ricky. And in a span of 3 hours, these two strong willed individuals came to one accord. You see, Ricky had to trust that Jackie Robinson wouldn't fight back. Well, Jackie Robinson, guys, was a natural born fighter. He had been nearly court martialed from the U.S. Army for refusing to give up his seat to a white officer on the bus. And as Buck O'Neill would say, Jackie Robinson could Duke and would Duke. He'd knock you on your rump. And so Ricky had to trust that this natural born fighter wouldn't fight back. Well, Jackie had to put his faith in a white man that he just laid eyes on, that he wouldn't get left out there hung to dry. And somehow or another, these two strong willed individuals came to one accord, and it literally changed the course of American history. It changed our game. And the question that is so commonly posed to me, was Jackie the best player in the Negro Leagues? No, he wasn't the best player on his own Kansas City Monarch team. And by no stretch is that to disparage Jackie Robinson, because Jackie Robinson is one of the greatest athletes in American sports history. He was a four sport letterman at UCLA. Baseball was his weakest sport. He was a much better basketball, football, track athlete than he was baseball player. Some say an even better tennis player. So there was nothing that Jackie Robinson could not do, but he was absolutely the right man. See, there were other ball players that were better, but Jackie was absolutely the right man to be the first. You see, he had what I like to refer to as the intangibles that better prepared him to deal with the racial hatred that he would be confronted with. He'd been a celebrated collegiate, an All American football player at UCLA. So certainly there was a little bit of cachet surrounding Jackie. So he is college educated. He had served in the military. He was disciplined. He would become married to the beautiful Rachel Robinson. And so he's stable. All of those attributes would be called upon to deal with the racial hatred that he would be confronted with. You see, when Jackie Robinson walks out on that field as a member of the Brooklyn Dodgers, he is called everything but, as my mother would say, but a child of God. And when he came to the plate, they knocked him down continuously. When, as a matter of fact, the opposing pitchers would oftentimes get fined if they didn't knock him down. And when he slid into second base, he would oftentimes come up wet where the opposition had spit on him. When the opposition slid into second, they came in spikes high trying to cut it. They did everything imaginable to break Jackie, but Jackie would not break. You see, some of those other Negro leaguers who had been so acclimated to segregation, they couldn't have handled it. Had you thrown a black cat on the field when Willie Wells walked out on the field, his natural instinct would have been pick that black cat up and throw it right back where it came from. But then the naysayers would have said, see, I told you they couldn't handle it. But if Jackie can't play, the naysayers would have said, see, I told you they weren't good enough to play in this league. So Branch Rickey had a double difficult task of identifying the right guy because failure was not an option on either side of the equation. If Jackie can't take the abuse, the experiment is over. If Jackie can't play, the experiment is over. It could have been another 5, 10, 15, 20 years or more before another black man would have gotten an opportunity to play in the major leagues. Folks, think about it. Had it been 20 years later, think about all the great stars we would have missed. We'd have missed Willie Mays. We'd have missed Henry Aaron. We'd have missed Ernie Banks, Roy Campanella, Monty Irvin. We would have missed Roberto Clemente, Bob Gibson. Can you imagine our sport without those great stars? And if you can imagine what it was like before 1947 because they didn't learn how to play baseball after 1947. They were playing great baseball well before 1947. So there's no question in my mind that had the doors opened sooner, the record books would be entirely different. And of course, we celebrate what we call beauty of the game. And I think it is an exhibit that we have on display at the museum by that same title, which is very aptly titled. And it celebrates the little known but very profound role that women played in the Negro Leagues. The three pioneering women that you see on this Sports Illustrated cover, Toni Stone, Mamie Peanut Johnson, and Connie Morgan, pioneers, women who competed with and against the men in the 1950s in the Negro Leagues. Toni Stone was the first of those pioneering women. As a matter of fact, Toni Stone took the roster place of someone you've probably heard his name before, the legendary Henry Aaron. Henry Aaron had been signed away by the Boston Braves from the Clowns in 1952. In 1953, they hired Toni Stone. She was followed by Mamie Peanut Johnson, a 5'3" pitcher with a strong right arm, and Connie Morgan, who hailed from Philadelphia. All three were tremendously talented athletes who came in and had an opportunity to compete with and against the men. But not only did you have women playing, you had women who were executives and leaders in the Negro Leagues, most notably Effa Manley. Effa Manley, of course, as many of you there in the New Jersey area probably know, she and her husband Abe owned the Newark Eagles. But it was Mrs. Manley who ran the day-to-day operations of that baseball team. She knew the business of baseball as well as any man, had great talent play for her. My dear friend, the late great Monty Irvin, Larry Doby, Leon Day, Willie Wells, all in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. Don Newcomb should be in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. All played for Effa Manley's Newark Eagles. She's the first woman to be nominated and inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame. And so I always find it interesting that he was this league born out of segregation that would become the driving force for social change in this country. A league born out of exclusion would become perhaps this nation's most inclusive entity. They didn't care what color you were, and they didn't care what gender you were. Can you play? Do you have something to offer? Really, that's the way it should be. And my friend, the late great John Jordan Buckle Neal, perhaps this game's greatest ambassador. Buckle Neal is the founder of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, legendary Negro leaguer in his own right, was a great player for the Kansas City Monarchs from 1938 to 1955, where he played first base and then later became a player manager for the Monarchs before moving into the major leagues as a scout, where he signed Hall of Famers Ernie Banks, Lou Brock, Lee Arthur Smith, hopefully future Hall of Famer Joe Carter, to their first professional contracts in the major leagues. And then he would break barriers himself by becoming the major's first Black coach in 1962 with the Chicago Cubs. But it is the effort that he put in to build this museum that I think is his greatest life accomplishment. And he dedicated the last 16 years of his life to not only building this museum, but promoting and raising money to keep this museum alive. And when I met Buck in 1993 for the first time, I remember the first thing that I asked him was, well, what motivated you to want to build a Negro Leagues Baseball Museum? And his answer was very succinct, but also very profound, so that we would be remembered. And really, that's the quest. That is what we're trying to do, is to make sure that those unsung baseball heroes of the Negro Leagues are never forgotten. And Buck just happened to be one of the greatest human beings to ever walk the face of this earth, who just also happened to be a great ball player. Yeah, we all fell in love with Buck, and we really didn't see him play. We fell in love with the Buck O'Neill who taught us about the heroes of the Negro Leagues. And we fell in love with Buck O'Neill, who so beautifully and vividly demonstrated to all of us that you could indeed get further in this life with love than you could with hate. And that is what really makes his legacy. But this museum is a testament to not only him, but all of the players who called the Negro Leagues home. And of course, my heart is still a little heavy over the passing of my childhood idol and my all time favorite Major League Baseball player, the great Henry Aaron. And this, folks, is my favorite image in the entire museum. That picture is of an 18-year-old Henry Aaron standing at the train station in Mobile, Alabama, and he's about to go leave to join the Indianapolis Clowns. At that time, he was a skinny, cross-handed hitting shortstop. And so for those who may not be familiar with that term, he was a right-hand hitter who was hitting with his left hand on top. That is unorthodox. The fear is that you break your wrist hitting in that manner. Well, Henry Aaron is knocking the cover off the baseball in a highly unorthodox fashion. When he gets to the Clowns, they reluctantly put the right hand on top because they didn't want to tinker with this kid's swing. But they put the right hand on top, and the rest, as they say, is history. He was shortly after discovered by the Boston Braves, who would become the Milwaukee Braves, who, of course, would become the Atlanta Braves. Henry Aaron will go down in this sport as one of its all-time greatest players. And quite frankly, in a game of numbers, no one's numbers are better than Henry Aaron. And I had the opportunity to tour Mr. Aaron through this museum in 1999. And it was the first and only time that I've ever been starstruck, except the times that I was always around Henry Aaron. Every time I was around Henry Aaron, I was reduced to that 12-year-old kid that circled the bases in my mother's living room when he hit home run 715 in Atlanta Fulton County Stadium. I'm circling the bases in nearby Crawfordville, Georgia, 80 miles away. I'm circling the bases in my mother's living room, jumping for joy. And I got to tour my childhood idol through the Negro Leagues Museum. And even better, we got a chance to sit down and eat ribs together. So, needless to say, it doesn't get any better than that for this kid from Crawfordville, Georgia. I will miss him immensely. We're all very saddened by the passing of this legendary man, where his roots began in the Negro Leagues. And that is so special. So, as you can well imagine, people walk by this photograph, and more times than not, they have to do a double take. And then you're like, wow, Henry Aaron's career began in the Negro Leagues. Willie Mays' career began in the Negro Leagues. We're talking about two of the greatest stars in Major League Baseball history, and it all begins in the Negro Leagues. And folks, they are just a sampling of the talent that was there in the Negro Leagues. One of the most amazing facts as I close out that helps you understand the tremendous impact that the Negro Leagues had on Major League Baseball. From 1949 through 1959, 9 of 11 National League most valuable players were former Negro League stars. Yeah. I mean, it is absolutely astounding. And the American League was very slow in signing black talent. The American League was just flat out reluctant. They didn't want to do it. Jackie breaks the color barrier in 1947. The Boston Red Sox become the last team to integrate in 1959 when they signed Elijah Pumpsie Green. And Elston Howard would become the first American League MVP with the New York Yankees. Elston, of course, had played here for the Kansas City Monarchs. And when Ellie was here with the Monarchs, his roommate was Ernie Banks. And Ernie Banks is on that photograph that you can see there. And it's hard for me to see exactly how many players are to his right, but that is Ernie Banks. He is, at least on my screen, he may be the fourth or fifth player from the right on that team, but that's Ernie Banks. And they were roommates when they were teammates here for the Monarchs. And Ernie would tell me they would stay up at night and they would kind of wonder out loud which of them were going to be the first to get to the major leagues, because now it's not a pipe dream. Jackie's already there. Other players had moved into the major leagues. So this was no longer a pipe dream. But honestly, they had to make Ernie leave. Ernie did not want to go because Ernie was comfortable here in Kansas City because he was around people who looked just like him. And the team did things together. They went places. And the minute he gets to Chicago, he's isolated. Yeah, they played a game. His teammates would go their own separate way. He and Gene Baker. And Gene Baker also played here for the Monarchs. They formed the Major's first double play tandem. Yeah, Gene Baker and Ernie Banks. Both had played here for the Kansas City Monarchs. Well, they are relegated to the South Side all by their lonesome. And so you can see why there was trepidation for a lot of these players, even as they were moving into the major leagues, because they were just moving into a world where people really didn't want them to be there. And so this museum is dedicated to telling that story. And it's dedicated to making sure that the legacy of the Negro League plays on, but maybe even more so that the life lessons from the Negro Leagues are utilized to inspire future generations of young people. I tell my guests all the time, if you walk away from this story with nothing other than this, what the Negro Leagues teaches us is very simple. In this great country of ours, if you dare to dream and you believe in yourself, you can do or be anything you want to be. You see, they dared to dream of playing baseball. They had no idea they were making history. Folks, they didn't care about making history. They just wanted to play ball. But the pride, the passion, the perseverance, the determination, the courage that they demonstrated in the face of adversity. You see, our story is not about the adversity, but rather what they did to overcome the adversity. And that's the real story. And that's the story that we proudly preserve, celebrate, illuminate here at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. So I want to thank Danella for the invitation to chat with you all tonight a little bit about the history of the Negro Leagues. And at this point in time, I want to open up the floor for any questions that you all might have of me. And if I don't know, I'll lie and act like I do. So bring them on.
That was great, Bob. I'm going to unmute the group, but if anyone want to share any comments,